The PlayStation VR2 is just around the corner, and it's launching with quite a few major titles, from completely new AAA exclusives such as Horizon Call of the Mountain, to existing titles with upcoming VR versions such as Resident Evil Village and Gran Turismo 7. Starting off with what is essentially the technical showcase for the PlayStation VR2. This is the big AAA launch title set in one of PlayStation's biggest and most popular franchises, and while this isn't an open world game and you don't even play as Aloy, this will still take you through the motions of the Horizon series and hopefully also be an enjoyable game that shows off the power of the PSVR 2.
Yeah, I think the game looks quite good, and it's one of the few games that we've kind of seen full access to from critics and stuff, and as a whole I think critics quite like it. I mean, it's got around 8 out of 10 on most reviews. I think Metacritic's around 78 or so. The graphics look incredible, I think. There's loads of climbing. The gameplay is plus 6 hours, which for a VR game is quite good. And as a whole, I think it's just quite well polished, and I think it's going to be good.
Yeah, I certainly hope so, because this is ultimately what will draw people into the headset. And being set in this huge franchise, even though it isn't a complete Horizon standard open world, I think there's still quite a lot on offer here. And as you said, VR games typically around 3 hours, so I think 6 hours isn't too bad. There were some complaints that there's a bit too much climbing, which I'm not sure is a bad thing, because climbing does work very well in VR. We've seen games like The Climb take full advantage of this, and that even went on to get a sequel. So games like this can be successful, and with a name like Call of the Mountain, you really have to expect a good amount of that type of gameplay.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think climbing can be done really well. I mean, I know there's other games literally called The Climb that people love, so I don't think that's too big of a deal, because it just adds to the experience. And like you said, a mountain, you want to see that scenery and get the full experience, so I think that could be seen as a good thing, along with the gameplay, which I think just using a bow and arrow along with the haptic controllers and haptic headset, I feel like that is a very smart choice for Sony in terms of what game they could have implemented into VR, because it feels like it's just going to work very well.
So this does seem to be taking full advantage of all of the PlayStation VR2's features. It has the eye tracking, which essentially helps you aim, as well as foveated rendering to focus processing power to where you're looking. So it helps with graphics as well as gameplay. Just all around, as you said, it seems like a great choice for a launch title. I'm really excited to check it out. So for that reason, I'm going to have to put it in ecstatic.
Now, for a sequel to one of the biggest titles on the PSVR that we actually played, Firewall. This one's called Firewall Ultra, and after playing the first game, I am quite excited, because the first game was great. I mean, it was a classic kind of CSGO shooter game, but in VR, and we both played it and we thought it was great. And I think having improved graphics along with just kind of more finished game is not a problem whatsoever, and if it gets the support that it deserves, it could be one of the best shooters that we've ever seen in VR.
So unfortunately, this will not be arriving on launch, but it has been confirmed for later this year. I think if it expands on the original with all of the new bells and whistles included on the PSVR 2, it could definitely be a worthy successor to the original.
I'm honestly leaning towards the top 2 tiers, and I'd probably put it in ecstatic.
Next up is a port of a flat screen game that aims to take full advantage of the PSVR 2's eye tracking technology. I think the decision by the developers to move into VR is a really good move, because for the original game, I believe you were sort of required to use this standalone eye tracking module, but of course there is one included in the PSVR 2.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of opening it up to a bigger player base, because on Steam the reviews are over 95% positive, which is just crazy. I mean, that's on the levels of some of the best games that we've seen, and I think it's a great move for the developers, and I think it's just a perfect fit for the PSVR 2. So because of how well it seems to be taking advantage of all the new hardware, I'm going to put it in very excited, I'd say. Next is Star Wars Tales from the Galaxy's Edge Enhanced Edition, which comes with a DLC that extends the game's playtime to 10 hours, which is huge for a VR game. It originally released on the Quest, and this just seems like a great upgrade for PSVR. The graphics seem much better from what I can tell.
So on top of just looking better, this does also include all of the new features from the PSVR 2. I've heard it takes advantage of the adaptive triggers, so each gun feels completely different. So I have played the original, but I didn't get a chance to check out the new DLC, and it's said to be actually even better than the original game. So I think this enhanced edition is the perfect time to try it. So for that reason, and all of the new features that are included in this version, I will say that I'm very excited. Next up is Cities VR. So this is of course a spin-off of Cities Skylines, the incredibly popular city building simulator, and this essentially just lets you do it in VR. So although we haven't seen any PSVR2 footage yet, this did release on the Quest last year, and it received fairly positive reviews, if not for a few technical issues with just how much you could include in your city.
Yeah, so of course, as we know, the Quest 2 is a standalone headset and it's quite limited in its capabilities, so I think we can kind of expect that it's going to improve on, like you said, the area in which you can build, which for a game like this is quite important because you're literally building a city. So it is something that I think they almost need to do, because that was one of the biggest criticisms of it on Quest, and I think if they can do that, then it's looking quite good for PSVR.
I would also like some graphical improvements, because it's not the best looking game, but really it is about building your own city, and if you're able to create a massive megalopolis in VR, I think this will be very, very enjoyable. But it remains to be seen whether the new content is really that substantial, and it ultimately comes down to whether or not they can really adapt to the Quest version and really raise it to the standards of the PSVR 2. So for that reason, I will say that I am cautiously optimistic.
Hello Neighbor Search and Rescue is a game on this list that I'm quite skeptical about, because from what I've seen it looks decent, but graphically it doesn't seem like it's that impressive, especially compared to the other games on this list. Gameplay wise it looks very simple, and based off of the reputation of the Hello Neighbor developers, it's just not looking too good.
So at the beginning of the trailer it does actually show off some nice looking CGI footage, but when it gets to the actual gameplay it's clear that this is just a Quest port. It doesn't look very interesting. I'm sure they could somehow take advantage of the Hello Neighbor franchise, because it is absolutely massive and it's fairly unique to the genre. But as you said, the developers definitely don't have the best reputation, with the launch of Hello Neighbor 2 not going down very well, and the continued development on the original Hello Neighbor turning it into a game that was just not very enjoyable in its final state. So based on what we've currently seen, I am very doubtful. Kayak VR Mirage might just be the best looking title on this list, which is quite something because it's up against games like Horizon and even flat screen ports like Village and Gran Turismo 7. Even though it's been developed by what seems to be a fairly small indie development team, the environments they've managed to create in this game are absolutely breathtaking. There aren't too many of them, there's maybe 4 or 5, but from what we've seen as the game has launched on other platforms, if they can successfully port it while maintaining that visual quality and also capitalizing on the new technology of the PSVR 2, I think this could become one of the best games on the platform.
Yeah, like you said, if they can keep everything just the same as it already is and implement the new features successfully, then this is going to be amazing, I think. You're going to feel every little splash of the water, and you're going to get a game that is already released to so much love, and I think there's not much that can go wrong.
So for that reason, I will say that I'm very excited.
Crossfire Sierra Squad is very unique, even though it's a shooter game, because it comes with not only a multiplayer but also a campaign. And what makes this campaign so special is that it can be played fully in co-op, which is something that you don't really see in VR too often. And I think if they can utilize all of the PSVR 2 features online with another person in a campaign, I think this could be incredible, because it's something that we just kind of haven't really heard of before.
So being part of the Crossfire franchise, this does have the backing of some really great games, because when this franchise is at its best, it can be really enjoyable.
Yeah, the concept's definitely there, and it's just if they can deliver on it or not. So for that reason, I'm gonna say probably cautiously optimistic, but if they can actually deliver, like I said, then it's gonna be great for the platform as a whole, because it just looks like a great idea.
After the Fall is yet another co-op shooter coming to the PlayStation VR 2. So this did release on other platforms a while ago, and overall people seem to like it. The one major complaint was a general lack of content, but with the complete edition they've added quite a bit of new content.
We played the game before together, and I think it's great because the shooting is great, the kind of leveling up system I thought was really well implemented, and the ability to play with friends is obviously a key feature. And I think if they can implement the haptics into the guns and into the game as a whole, that's just going to improve on an already great game, so I don't really see what can go wrong.
As long as this new content is up to the standard of the original campaign and really just works to expand it, and like you said, as long as they manage to nail the new mechanics from the PSVR 2, I really do think that this will become the definitive version of the game. So for that reason, I will put it in very excited.
Pavlov is one of the biggest VR multiplayer shooters of all time, and I think the move to PSVR 2 is a very smart one by the developer. It's a game that's been loved for years by the player base, and I think improving on it with haptics, once again with the guns, I think is something that will just make the game that bit better, and taking a game that's already great, and it's not the Quest reduced version, it's the same as the PC version, so you're going to get all of the tanks, the vehicles, everything that makes Pavlov that bit better than a lot of other shooters you're getting, and as a whole it's going to be a great addition to the PSVR 2 launch lineup.
One thing that does seem to be missing from this version of the game is the mods, and this is one of the biggest draws of Pavlov. Even the Quest version has access to mods. So although we are getting all of the new content included in the PC version, if it doesn't have mod support, I feel like that might just be a pretty major drawback. But I think the content, with all of the years of updates on the PC side, will be enough to deliver a very solid title. And I think if they're able to port it correctly, I don't think there's much that they can mess up.
Yeah, and I think having Pavlov on the platform is a must-have, so I'm going to put it in very excited.
Next up is the only roguelike in the PSVR 2 launch lineup. It's being developed by a relatively small indie studio, but it does seem to deliver on the promise of its genre. I do think that roguelikes can work very well in virtual reality, as there's just so much room for differences in each playthrough, and ultimately, if they can nail that replayability, then I do think that this does have the potential to become one of the best value titles on the platform.
For me, I think what makes this unique is kind of the setting of it all, kind of in a fantasy World War II area, and I think it's a great idea from the developers to introduce this new style of gameplay to the platform, because it's not something that you can really see when it comes to the lineup of games, so having that represented through this game is an all-round good idea, I think, and it seems like it will deliver on the promise that's been made for the genre. And for that reason, I think I'd probably put this into very excited. Switchback VR is yet another game from the Dark Pictures anthology, and it's sort of a spiritual successor to Rush of Blood, the massively popular game on the original PSVR. And this looks to be like a new and improved version of that, but taking advantage of eye tracking to really put that scare into the game, and the haptics just to make it feel that bit more realistic, which when playing a horror game is really necessary, because that immersion is what puts the scare into the game, and I think if it were missing that, it would be nowhere near as good as it looks.
So being part of the Dark Pictures anthology, this game has a lot of room to experiment and bring back characters from those games and use them to its full advantage to absolutely terrify the players. This also looks to be quite a lot bigger than Rush of Blood, with a much longer campaign and hopefully a lot more replayability with the multiple paths that it offers you.
Based off of the success of Rush of Blood, I have quite a bit of hope that this is going to be great, and for that reason I'd say maybe even ecstatic.
What the Bat is probably the least serious title on this list, but that doesn't mean that it won't still be a very enjoyable title. It's developed by the creators of What the Golf, which was a very successful flat screen game, and it looks like they've done a great job in adapting their formula into virtual reality. This has already launched on other platforms like the Quest, and as long as they can port it to the PSVR 2 with all of the new mechanics that it offers, I really don't see how they could possibly mess it up.
When I look at it, it definitely gives me a job simulator type of feeling, which is not a bad thing at all. I absolutely love those games, and I think it has potential to become a great game just to mess around in and have some fun. And even though it might not have a massive story or great graphics, it seems like it's just one of those standard games that you get with VR that everyone likes, that just really allows you to experiment with the technology and have some fun.
It's a wacky, do what you want kind of title, and those are really what works best in virtual reality. So for that reason, I'll put it in very excited.
The first of the two Resident Evil titles on this list is Resident Evil Village, which originally released to great reviews and love from pretty much everyone, and I think a VR implementation could be incredible. For the original PSVR, we saw RE7 get made into VR, and it was quite good. I mean, there was a few limitations, but as a whole, it was a good game. And I think making use of the new technology and the haptics, especially once again for the horror element, that could turn a great game into a potential VR classic.
So we have seen a surprising amount of gameplay from this title. I was skeptical with the floating hands. I'm not a big fan of those myself, and it didn't really show off some of the more intricate interactions that are possible in virtual reality. But with the release of the most recent trailer, my levels of anticipation have gone through the roof. We've seen interactions like manually healing, properly reloading your weapons, and even punching the Lycans, which wasn't possible in the original game. So not only does this look to port the game to VR, but it also looks to expand it, and that's why I'll place it in ecstatic. Resident Evil 4 is probably the title we know least about. We have gotten a few trailers for the flat screen version, but all we've got on the side of VR is that PSVR2 content is in development, so we might not even be getting the full game, which would be a shame. If we do get the full game and it's adapted just as well as Village looks to be, this could also turn into one of the best VR titles on the platform, but it remains to be seen just how much of the game will be playable in VR.
So I think if it can live up to the Quest version, but with enhanced graphics and modernised gameplay, then this should be an instant VR classic.
But it does remain to be seen just how much will be playable on the PSVR 2, so for that reason, I think we have to go in cautiously optimistic. If the game will be fully playable in VR, this could easily move up to ecstatic.
Saints and Sinners Retribution is a sequel to a massively successful VR game that released a few years ago but is still seen as one of the best VR titles of all time. Unfortunately, the sequel did have a bit of a rocky launch on the Quest because of technical issues, and the performance on the Quest just wasn't too great, but hopefully the power of the PS5 and some time for the developers to squash the bugs, I think we could finally see this title living up to the original game.
On top of the technical issues the game had on the Quest, people did also complain that it might not have been the sequel they had hoped for. There were reports that it was quite similar to the original game, and that ultimately it only offered up a few new locations and weapons, but overall felt like just a 1.5 version of the original. Although they've still got the solid foundations of Saints and Sinners, and the gameplay is of course still incredibly enjoyable. A few tweaks here and there are certainly needed, but if they can get this game into working order, I think it could still be a fairly enjoyable title on the PSVR 2. But it does ultimately come down to just how much of an improvement it is over the Quest 2 version.
Yeah, I think just because we don't know enough about the state of the game on the PlayStation platform, I'm going to put it in cautiously optimistic.
And finally, one of the biggest titles on this list, of course, it's Gran Turismo 7. Having a game of this scale and genre on the PlayStation VR 2 will no doubt be a massive draw to the headset. And for racing fans who are constantly trying to get the most immersive experience, the PlayStation VR 2 could become an essential accessory. It does seem like they've managed to maintain the beautiful visuals from the flat screen version and also take advantage of the benefits of virtual reality.
Yeah, and I think based off of the original Gran Turismo VR experience that came part of the first PSVR, we can expect some good things because it came to some pretty good reviews, and that wasn't the most extensive game with graphics that were not anything overwhelming. So it's a good sign for the PSVR 2 in that this one looks so much better, and having such a big franchise as part of the game collection is a big win for everyone, but in particular fans of racing games. And for that reason, I think it's got to go. I'm very excited.